Вместо предисловия. Страшные годы ежовщины я провела 17 месяцев в тюремных очередях в Ленинграде. Как-то раз кто-то опознал меня. Тогда стоящая за мной женщина с голубыми губами, которая, конечно, никогда в жизни не слыхала моего имени, очнулась от свойственного нам всем оцепенения и спросила меня на ухо. Там все говорили шепотом: «А это вы можете описать?» И я сказала: «Могу». Тогда что-то вроде улыбки скользнуло по тому, что некогда было ее лицом. 1 апреля 1957 год. Ленинград.
Texting.
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 Texting. Texting. Texting. Texting.
Texting.
Texting.
Mark, Will, and Tomek present
Texting.
You ready? Hello, all you textual deviants, and welcome to another episode of Texting with me, Tomek, in Leningrad.
And with me, Mark Will, in Purgatory.
Today, we are going to be discussing one of Russia's most revered recent poets, Anna Akhmatova. I'm going to read a tiny little biography provided by the Poetry Foundation.
Before I do
that, do you want to say anything? Yeah.
I do.
Okay.
Gogol, Kandinsky, Kino, Akhmatova. It's like half of your texts that you choose are Russian related. Have you noticed this pattern?
Have you noticed that I live in Russia?
Well, I know, but have you noticed that I live in Purgatory or Taiwan, and, you know, my choices are not necessarily connected to Taiwan. I guess you could say the time that we looked at the Heart Sutra,
right?
That certainly has a Taiwanese connection, but otherwise, I've not picked Taiwan-centric texts, and so after noticing this pattern, I've been asking myself if maybe I should find something more specifically Taiwanese. How would you feel about that?
Well, a lot of things come to my mind when you say that. One, obviously Russia has a ridiculously rich literary tradition. Two, it's one of the reasons I came to Russia. And three, I feel like this weird defensive need to big up the cultural aspects of Russia in the current political climate.
The Russophobic political climate, almost a
exactly.
client climate.
Yeah, so we're over here doing the soft power diplomacy, you know, keeping Russia in the conversation, reminding people that, that all is not ill in this side of the world.
Just
or
admit
maybe
it. You're
ill,
a Putin puppet trying to make Russia great again.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of one moment from my field trip today. And I'll talk about that later, though.
Okay.
All right, so bear with me for this rather long introductory paragraph for those people in our audience who will have never heard the name Anna Akhmatova. Anna Akhmatova is regarded as one of Russia's greatest poets. In addition to poetry, she wrote prose, including memoirs, autobiographical pieces, and literary scholarship on Russian writers such as Pushkin. She also translated Italian, French, Armenian, and Korean poetry. In her lifetime, Akhmatova experienced both pre-revolutionary and Soviet Russia, yet her verse extended and preserved classical Russian culture during periods of avant-garde radicalism and formal experimentation, as well as the suffocating ideological strictures of socialist realism. Akhmatova shared the fate that befell many of her brilliant contemporaries, including Mandelstam, Pasternak, and Marina Ivanovna Tsvetaeva. Although she lived a long life, it was darkened disproportionately by calamitous moments. Isaiah Berlin, who visited Akhmatova in her Leningrad apartment in November 1945 while serving in Russia as first secretary of the British Embassy, aptly described her as a tragic queen, according to Georgi Dalos. Berlin's assessment has echoed through generations of readers who understand Akhmatova, her person, poetry, and more nebulously her poetic persona, as the iconic representation of noble beauty and catastrophic predicament. Okay, so
tragic queen.
There. Yeah, and what's the thing you keep sending me on WhatsApp? Is that the broken-nosed beauties? Is that also a reference to Akhmatova?
Well, you sent me an article about her and Requiem by some American essayist.
That was the one by Clive James?
That name doesn't sound right, but
okay.
It's like the project was cultural preservation, and Requiem was considered one of the great classics of 20th century world culture, maybe. And
okay.
this guy described her as a femme fatale and a broken-nosed beauty, which is interesting when you see pictures of Madame Akhmatova, because that's not apparently she was quite alluring, and women hated her because she tempted their husbands and so on, but she looks to me like a Russian Virginia Woolf, which is not necessarily the most alluring description I can think of.
Right. Yeah, she reminds me of this girl I knew when I lived in Texas named Mariana, who wasn't really that attractive stereotypically, but had a really magnetic presence and just was so full of life that I can see why many people would just want to be around her. So I think I'm sure you've met people like that as well, who just have a presence. And
apparently she had this personal magnetism,
right,
that drove the men wild.
Does anyone come to mind for you?
Well, I just as I say, physically I see a resemblance to Virginia Woolf.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, maybe she had the same allure in person with her sparkling conversation and so on, attracting not only men but women too.
Right. Well, poets, I don't want to generalize too much, but certain poets definitely have, if nothing else, they just have a lust for life and an energy that typical people don't have. When I think about the time that we interviewed Cohen, that's one of the things that jumped out, right? This guy was in his probably late 70s, and he had more energy than any of us, and he was drinking us all under the table.
Yes, exactly.
So it's just some people are born with extra sensitivity or heightened just natural energy.
And listeners, we're talking about the great Korean poet Goen, whom Tomek and I had the chance to interview when we were in Korea.
Yeah.
That was a wonderful night.
An epic night, absolutely. So today we'll be looking at her most well-known poem, although that is arguable because she does have another poem called Poem Without a Hero, which also is highly acclaimed. But still probably the poem that she's best known for, and it's called Requiem. And forgive me, but I'll do one more tiny little intro, okay? So, started in 1935 after the arrests of Akhmatova's son, Lev Gumilyov, and her former partner Nikolai Punin, Requiem tells a horrifically common tale of the Soviet Great Terror, or the Stalinist purges. The arbitrary imprisonment of loved ones. Its famous instead of a foreword describes a woman standing in line with hundreds of others beside a prison wall, waiting for the doors to open so they can hand parcels to prisoners. This woman learns that Akhmatova is a poet and asks her if she can put the horror they are living through into words. Akhmatova answers affirmatively, conscious that through her poem she does not only tell her own story, but a nation of 100 million cries out. I feel like that's kind of important to explain. So
She says Mogu.
yeah, Mogu, exactly. And
I looked at some of the original Russian, I'm proud to say.
nice.
Mogu.
Yeah, the whole part is «А это вы можете описать?» И я сказала «Могу».
Well
So, yeah.
read.
Thank you.
So it's
I think I'm
like
actually going to throw this in the intro on my version, if nothing else. I'm going to have Liliana read just this very first section
please,
in
yeah,
Russian.
great.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
So listeners, if you hear that first part, it will be the instead of a preface. If you're reading the English version, just that section was read for you at the start.
It's almost as though this old woman is her muse, like if you think of Homer, who invokes the muse before delivering his epic poem, he asked the goddess to sing for him, right? It's almost like a variation on that,
Right, and you wonder if it's like a literary device for bringing us into the poem, or if it's like a genuine experience she had. I mean, I guess neither would surprise me, but I kind of took it at face value.
Right. Well, there was no doubt some old woman there that she encountered, and maybe she did ask her to try to record what happened. One of the purposes of literature is to testify, to bear witness.
Right. So we're going to be mainly focusing on Requiem, and it's a 7-page poem, so we won't have time to close read everything. I've suggested to Mark before recording today that we look at the first few stanzas before it gets to this numbered part, which goes on for 10 stanzas. But before we even do that, I feel like we need to provide and perhaps discuss a little bit the context, what she's responding to, which is this Yezhov terror, as she calls it, the Stalinist regime and the repressions that were going on at the time. So,
but interestingly, it's not called the Stalinist terror. It's named for one of Stalin's henchmen, I guess you could say.
Right.
This Yezhov.
Who was then executed.
Right. Which, I mean, I was just reading about that today. Interesting, right? As though, this one guy is responsible for everything. It's like one bad apple, one rogue official caused all this trouble. Nobody knew what was happening. But then we caught him and got to the bottom of it, got rid of him, and everything was fine after that.
But the thing is, though, if I remember correctly, like Stalin was executing many, many people in positions of power throughout his reign. So it was one of those things where imagine like you're living during a time where, everyone's in a state of fear. Everyone's worried about getting brought in for some treasonous act or act of disloyalty. And yet the people who are highest up in the party are often the most at risk. So it's like, it's just crazy, right? I mean, really no one is safe if you could be Stalin's right-hand person and be the next in line. I think we're seeing similar things now, to be honest. I think since the start of the war, it seems like many people very close to Putin, advisors who maybe gave him bad advice or made poor predictions about how successful the war would be, they're the ones who fall. But that's like just doubly harrowing. In which I don't know if it's even more harrowing, but it just shows how pervasive that spread of fear is. It's that even if you try your best to be a good boy and toe the line, that doesn't really present you with any additional security.
Right.
That's how it seems to me anyway. What do you want to say? Do you want to say anything about that particular time period from your own like historical research, or over the years, like how you've perceived that period?
Well,
and
it's
after
interesting.
that, I want to talk a little bit about that.
It's interesting. I mean, she uses the phrase "the frightening years of the Yezhov terror," but then later she mentions 17 months, which doesn't seem like that long, Like 17 months, she, I guess, went to this prison near Finland Station, the Crosses, where her son was apparently, and maybe her husband or common law husband, partner, whatever. So she just went trying to visit them for 17 months, and then what happened? The husband or common law husband died in there, right? Was the son released? And is that why, she stopped after that? Because
I assume
when we're talking about years, does that mean like this feeling of dread and anxiety lingered even after Yezhov himself was eliminated? Like it's not clear to me what time period we're talking about. We got 17 months, and then we got the frightening years of the Yezhov.
It was years, bro. The 17 months is just the time that she herself was waiting next on this prison wall, trying to get these parcels in to her kid. So,
but why is that? Was he released afterwards?
It could have been that, or equally likely, he was sent away to a gulag outside of Moscow, outside of St. Petersburg.
Okay, well, she mentions
like Punin does not die in St. Petersburg. He dies far away in a gulag.
Well, she mentions a Siberian blizzard. Maybe they were sent to Siberia, or one or the other of them was.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like her son was in and out of prison, several times.
Okay, so this was like a holding facility, and they shipped him off to a gulag after that.
I assume so,
Okay.
Yeah, exactly right.
I see.
So
it's like Belmarsh Prison.
I don't know what that is.
Well, that's where Assange is being kept now, and it is kind of a holding facility. They are sent elsewhere after that. Although it's horrible enough as it is.
Where is that?
Well, Belmarsh is in the UK.
Because is he still in the UK? I thought he was like in America now or something.
No, they're trying to extradite him, but that hasn't happened yet, unless that happened today.
One interesting moment from my tour today, and probably I should describe that in more narrative form later, but our tour guide mentioned the name of that prison, and I don't remember the name, and he said, "Do you know what this place is?" And one of my students said, "I think it's a prison in St. Petersburg." He said, "It's a prison, but don't say it's St. Petersburg. Say Leningrad." And he was like really emphatic about that. Like St. Petersburg shouldn't be tarred by that legacy, Like let's keep that specific to the ills of this period.
But wasn't it built before that?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm just relaying this little moment.
What prison? Now I'm wondering, what prison was Dostoevsky in? He was sentenced to death and then reprieved at the last moment just before his execution.
Right. Yeah.
And then he was in prison. Where?
Well, he was in Siberia. He went to
Siberia. But
yeah.
I wonder, did he ever spend any time? And I've read The House of the Dead, so I should know this.
Me too. Yeah.
But I wonder if he ever did any time in like one of the St. Petersburg prisons, and it would have been before it was Leningrad, obviously.
Right. Yeah, these are things worth pursuing.
Yeah. We're so well prepared that we have no answers for these questions.
No, we just have.
Well,
we
shit
just
comes
have a lot
up.
of questions.
Yeah, yeah.
We have a lot of questions. Yeah,
Things come up.
But so, unless you want me just to jump into a couple incidents I've had thinking about Stalin recently, I'd like to know your thoughts.
Well, I don't have anything to say about Stalin. I wanted to talk about the title of the poem that we're reading today.
Okay, well then, can I just share like a couple thoughts, and if you have anything to respond to what I say, like great. If you don't, we'll just move on. Okay. So, as you may know, like Stalin's legacy in Russia is quite contested, and I find that fairly disturbing because I didn't realize just how contentious his legacy is. Obviously, the majority of his statues seems like disappeared, and
well, I'll jump in here. I mean, this is what we saw on our trip to the Russian Far East all those years ago. It's like all the Lenin statues and so on were well preserved. He's still a respected, father of the modern Russian nation, and then Stalin was completely disappeared. Like there was no sign of him anywhere officially, and that was quite a striking contrast, so it's like officially Lenin was the good communist Russian and Stalin was the bad communist Russian, right? The good cop and the bad cop. But then, of course, we had the experience with some of the locals who, well, some of them tried to defend Stalin, and then others attacked Lenin. Remember that? So what is your impression of things now?
Yeah, so actually that's a really good point. You bring up that, like, we still have that on YouTube, actually, that interview that I did with that girl. What was her name? Do you remember? Anna or something?
Olia,
that's right. Where she's quite robust in her defense of Stalin. And
she actually said, if I remember correctly, hey, it's not such a big deal. Most of the people he killed were Jews anyway.
I don't know if it came off just like that. But regardless, the point is that... Am I
remembering that wrong?
I remember the word coming up. I remember her like searching for the word Jewish and then you giving it to her. But I don't remember her saying it in such a like horribly dismissive way.
I don't know. I thought there
I'm just uncomfortable with that phrasing. I'm not sure if she said it like that.
I thought there was a pretty strong whiff of anti-Semitism.
Okay, I'll have to revisit the lost tapes. But no, so coming back, so first of all, there is like some Stalin memorabilia that you'll find even at souvenir shops, so that's one thing. You'll see him there. There are some statues that still remain, and I think we've talked before on the pod about how World War II, like the Great Patriotic War or the Great War, is still like a massive center of propaganda in Russia. So, and Stalin's intimately connected to that in terms of like winning the war. So that's like one feather in his cap. Then you've got like
well, I'll just point out here that he was celebrated even in the U.S. I mean, during the war, of course. Richard Wolff, the Marxist economist, points out that at one time there was like a Joseph Stalin U.S. postage stamp.
Wow.
So Uncle Joe.
And that was after these purges.
It would have been. It had to have been, right? This would have been the 40s, and this was in the 30s, if not earlier. Lenin died in 24, I want to say. I looked this up today, but anyway, these purges began in the 30s, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they may have been, hidden or maybe the West didn't know the scale of what happened.
Or maybe they did and they swept it under the rug because
right.
He became useful to them in the 40s during the war against Hitler.
Well, on that note, I was talking to my colleague Greg about some of this stuff, and he said actually the communist artists in America at that time were suddenly given like a elevated status because they were the most effective propagandists against fascism. And then you get McCarthyism where they're suddenly, all persecuted. So that's interesting. Did you know that?
Well, I knew about like the communist preeminence in Spain, right? Like the civil war against the fascists there. You had,
but it's interesting.
The United
America
Front
actively sought out these like communist artists because they thought they'd be effective in this particular historical moment.
Do you have any examples like Paul
I'll
Robeson?
I'll have to look it up, or I'll have to find some sources.
You know Paul Robeson, the African American singer who was, I think, a lifelong communist. But then, and I think he was pretty popular at one time, maybe this time you're talking about, but then like during the McCarthy period there was a backlash. Right.
I don't want us to drag this out too long, and I want to tell my little story, and then you react, or we got to get to the poem. So I find it, so I taught this poem this week, Requiem, and just kind of asked I only have 2 students in this class, which is kind of nice, but just asked them how they felt about like the Stalin regime. And actually I think only one student was present at that time, and she was like reluctant to take a position, to be honest. And she said, like, and even in her history classes, she says, like, depending on the teacher, one teacher will portray him in a negative light and one more positively. And then later that day in the lunch cafeteria, I sat down with some colleagues and got into a conversation with this, I think he's Irish. He's Scottish, a Scottish guy. And I just like mentioned how I'm sad that Stalin doesn't seem more universally condemned, considering how many people suffered under his rule. And he took a very provocative position, you might say, or just whatever. That's his honest opinion. But, he was quick. He's the economics teacher, and he was quick to point out like the massive gains that Russia made. He's like, have you ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Like, yeah, I've heard of it. Like, everybody's fucking heard of it. But he's like, it's because I was like saying, what about human rights? Like, human rights? Think about human rights when you don't have any bread, kind of thing. So, and that's fair enough. And then he would also, on one hand, he was taking the economic angle to like prop up Stalin, and then he would like, I would say, like, muddy the waters or do the whataboutism by pointing out, well, what about in America? How you guys, killed all your red and black people, or he's like, Clinton killed people, like kind of like show, there's a common argument, right? It's like, and I'm not even trying to like 100% dismiss that line of thought, like that's fine. But then I was like, yeah, but what about scale? And he's like, well, Stalin once said, if you kill one man, you've killed a million, something like that. Like,
Okay.
I think that's like some famous quote from Stalin. Anyway, my point is like, I don't really know sometimes how helpful it is to just like equivocate and just say, look, leaders are all fucked up. They are, usually, right? They almost always are, but
I don't have a problem with that. They're all gangsters of one form or another.
Yeah, but like, so do we? But I'm more comfortable with that position than the defense of him. That's what.
Well,
like,
that's the so-called
startled by.
That's the so-called tanky position, right? You've heard this term?
No, go on.
Oh, well, a tanky is someone who, accepts like the Soviet decision to send the tanks into Czechoslovakia. I think that's where the term comes from. So it's
okay.
like a leftist position which is a kind of apologetics for authoritarianism. It's basically leftist authoritarianism.
So it's kind of like saying if you have to crack some eggs, like that's what it takes.
You can,
kinda like
a
right?
revolution is not a tea party or whatever the phrase
Right.
is. Is that Emma Goldman or I don't know, but yeah, it's that basic attitude. But then it's also used as a slur, like people who try to bring historical context to the current Russia-Ukraine conflict are sometimes called tankies, completely irrationally. Like, Putin's not even communist, you dumb shit.
Yeah, I mean, I just am not comfortable with. Yeah, I mean, I like in Korea, right? The most repressive dictator. I can't even remember his
Park
name. But I think it
Chung-hee.
was like. Yeah, but that's when Korea saw the most economic gains, right? So I get that that's also a common trope throughout the world, that some of the hardline dictators can achieve things with their government. I mean, even Peter, right? Peter the Great. I mean, St. Petersburg is supposed to be a city built on bones. I mean, so. But anyway, my point is, I'm saying in a very long-winded way, like, is there room to defend Stalin? Because I'm not comfortable defending Stalin. He seems to me like I think we should be able to just say unequivocally, this guy was a fucking maniac, and but again, I'm not even like a historian, so I don't even, I just get that impression.
Well,
What do you think?
I guess I would say I don't have a problem with that, but are you also going to say the same thing about his ideological opponents?
I
Or
guess
is that
so, but
dismissed,
maybe
is
I'm
that
not
dismissed
sure.
as whataboutism? I mean,
Whataboutism has its place.
yeah. So would you say the same thing about his ideological opponents? Like, would you
And
say
I guess
that
that's
about?
where I am a bit uncomfortable.
Would you say that about, for example, Truman, who dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan?
Yeah, and that's why I do want to reserve my judgment until I am better versed in history. But we also can't say that every world leader is equal, right? Even if they all have certain degrees of bastardness.
Bastardness. Okay.
I mean, right? We can't just say.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
but how do you quantify bastardness or monstrosity or evil?
Well, it just seems like Stalin was particularly inhumane.
You're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
So, well, don't you think that Stalin seems especially pernicious?
Based on what I know, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. So, Requiem. I hope our listeners remember the little intro that I gave. It's a eulogy by Anna Akhmatova about the suffering of people under the Great Purge, and I'll read the first stanza. And
Well, can we, before we look at the
Okay, go on,
text,
go on.
what about the title?
Sure.
Can we talk about Requiem,
yes,
this title?
So Requiem, religious connotations, or not only connotations but denotation. It's like a Catholic mass for the dead,
Yes.
right?
Because the first line of that mass, the Latin mass, is Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, which means give them eternal rest, Lord.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is, how does that relate to this piece? She is, in a way, composing her own secular mass for the dead.
Right.
Eternal rest
Right.
for the dead. Or some kind of monument to the dead. Later she says she's weaving a shroud. Her verses are a kind of shroud for the dead, which is a beautiful image.
Yeah.
But this word requies, rest, interesting. It's also in R.I.P. Requiescat in pace. May he or she rest in peace. R.I.P.
Nice.
So it's very much, I don't know, it's prevalent throughout Western culture or the cultures of the world that have been influenced by Roman or Latin-based culture.
So, should I read this first short stanza?
Go ahead.
Okay. Not under foreign skies, nor under foreign wings protected, I shared all this with my own people, there where misfortune had abandoned us. Any thoughts on that first stanza?
Well, I did look at the original Russian, at least part of it, and I noticed the very first word is "niet." No.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, the way that it's split up there with a comma too.
It begins with a
and not under.
It begins with a negation, which is not really reflected in that translation.
Right. It's a double negative. No and not under in the Russian.
Yeah.
Right? No and not under the foreign skies.
And that word "foreign" is repeated twice, or repeated once.
Right.
It occurs twice, and then in the next two lines, you've got this play on narodom and narod, which is what? Countryman and country? Is that right?
I think so.
My country, my people. So it seems like she's saying, you can't blame this on external enemies, which we may have. We do have people that wish us ill, or other countries or other world powers, but we did this to ourselves, she seems to be saying.
Okay, that's an interesting take. I interpreted it differently.
Okay.
I took it, so one of the things that stands out about Akhmatova is that she always elected to stay in St. Petersburg, where a lot of intellectuals immigrated. And I felt like that was extremely prescient now because a huge number of people have left Russia in the last year. Just a massive amount, whether they're escaping mobilization or they're young intellectuals, young professionals, people who just said that they've had enough, they don't want to be here. And Akhmatova has a quote. I think I printed it out. Got it somewhere in my notes. I'll just read it really quickly. She says something about the taste of foreign bread. Now I can't find it, but it's she said she felt sorry for people who were exiled because the taste of foreign bread is like bitter, something like that. So I just think that's really important that she's not protected under foreign wings. For me, that's like, I don't have that luxury. I'm sticking it
like
out.
the people who chose exile. They were like,
here it is, really quick. I feel some pity for an exile, like somebody sick or a prisoner. A refugee has to walk a dark road, and foreign bread has a bitter flavor.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how does that contradict my reading?
It doesn't, but it's just a different emphasis.
I see.
Yeah.
But do you agree that she's saying, we did this to ourselves? Like, this happened in my
I think she should
country.
say that.
This happened in my country, among my countrymen,
Yeah.
Is that right? Narod is country?
I know in Polish, narodem, is like your nation.
Yeah, so my nation, my fellow citizens, we did this. I just it's in this quatrain, the first two lines have the word foreign or some form of the word foreign, and then the next two lines have some word or some form of the word, nation or people of this nation. It's meaningful, right? That contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to read the instead of a preface?
The English.
Yeah.
Okay. Instead of a preface, during the frightening years of the Yezhov terror, I spent 17 months waiting in prison queues in Leningrad. One day, somehow, someone picked me out. On that occasion, there was a woman standing behind me, her lips blue with cold, who, of course, had never in her life heard my name. Jolted out of the torpor characteristic of all of us, she said into my ear, everyone whispered there, "Could one ever describe this?" And I answered, "I can." It was then that something like a smile slid across what had previously been just a face.
Mm-hmm.
The 1st of April in the year 1957, Leningrad. She dates each of these fragments, each section has a date, and it's interesting to compare those. The first quatrain that you read was dated 1961, so that was added, I guess, last. That was probably the last thing she composed, kind of as an epigraph to the whole thing. And then instead of a preface, written 1957. And this is years after, the main events or main non-events, since not much happens. Like, this is 20 years,
right.
Almost 20 years later,
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't think I gave it enough attention before because, in a way, this stanza seems like it's critical, as we kind of talked about before, to like opening up the whole poem, and yet the majority of the poem was meant to have been written considerably earlier.
Well, these experiences marked her for the rest of her life. She was haunted by what she had seen, and how could she not be?
Right.
But going back to this idea of exile, I meant to ask this when you first brought it up. Do you relate to what she says? Like, we're both exiles, aren't we? We're both refugees of sorts. Like, do you feel that foreign bread tastes bitter?
Yeah, it's an interesting line. And the idea of home is a very interesting one. I mean, I think, what do the Beatles say about home? Get back, right? Get back to where you once belonged.
Mm-hmm. But they also said she's leaving home.
And then you've got the home is where the heart is. Home is, but I'm quoting great Jill Scott Heron. Not the Elvis Presley.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know Jill Scott Heron?
Yes, but I don't know this particular piece. I know the.
No, he said home is where the hatred is.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. that's
yeah, there
funny.
you go.
Okay.
The revolution will not be televised.
Right. We should do that as one of our texts at some point. But anyway, that my situation is different than yours, because like I had these like three competing identities growing up of like Poland, England, America. So I didn't really feel so much like I was like leaving home.
Well, neither did I.
Neither
did I, but
But I mean, you had a place that was like markedly home, whether
I never felt that.
Embraced it or not.
I never felt that.
Okay, well, why not?
Well, I just always felt like an outsider. I mean, very early on, I saw through all the red, white, and blue bullshit and just felt alienated from it.
Yeah, but that's such a different narrative. Politics is such a different world in a way than like home. Home for me is like the feeling that you get on a street.
Well,
like,
I may have
or
mentioned
like
this.
A shop even.
Well, okay, yes. I mean, there are certain people and places, of course, friends and family, and they're certainly pleasant associations with.
But what about streets? Like, let's keep it strictly physical.
Right.
Because I feel like that's pretty important.
Yeah, sure. I have certain fond Proustian recollections of, streets and locales and all of that, but that, you can probably have that experience anywhere, right? Like even in a prison, let's say, you might have your preferred hangout spots,
Yeah, and everything. Yeah, so basically that narrative feels more romantic than real to me. Like that idea of like there being a home, There might be something to it, like psychologically about returning to the place or being close to the place where you grew up. I mean, I can see how that can be important, but I've just kind of given up on it,
Well, what's her...
I have to accept that.
Well, what's Akhmatova's, background? Like, she grew up in relative privilege, right? She lived on an estate or something, and then she married a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, and, her husband's own property, and so... she may have had more reason to feel at home in Russia because her setup wasn't too bad compared to others.
Right, although it became pretty good.
Yes.
During...
Yeah. But, she herself was never imprisoned, right? Not to diminish the suffering that she experienced when her male relations were taken away, of course, but...
And even financially, I think when she left the flat on Fontane, like where she was living with Punin, I think she was almost like homeless at one point. Like all she had was suitcase and a couple things. I mean, she lived at certain points. She lived very, very humbly and was just surviving on some translating work that she was doing.
And she kept this manuscript secret during all this time. It was only circulated, in samizdat circles, right? Like it was self-published, only shown to trusted confidants, because if it fell into the wrong hands, she may have really experienced greater, adverse consequences. I think it wasn't even published officially until the 80s, right? And then she didn't. Well, let's see. She published at least part of it. I think maybe it was 1961 when she added that epigraph or whatever. But I remember reading she waited until after the death of Stalin. And Khrushchev had already made comments about he made a speech about the dangers of the cult of personality, which was kind of a denunciation of Stalin and his crimes, right?
Right. Yeah, so we've put... I mean, we don't know her exact reasons for staying. We don't know how much of that should be like celebrated in terms of her courage, or whether it was... We don't know the exact reasons, right? And I'm not here to judge people who leave Russia now, or people who choose to stay. Everybody's got their own journey and their own motivations. So, but that is notable.
A question I've asked myself, though. Like, instead of fleeing to the other side of the world, would it have been more brave to stay and try to right the sinking ship that is the American empire? I mean, I don't lose sleep over this question, but I've asked myself that, when I'm in particularly...
Probably you should probably
when I'm in particularly self-critical moods, like more than usual. But
I think an interesting. Can I move on?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry,
Y-
I think an
that
interesting
doesn't-
angle to explore.
Yeah, that question has.
No, I just feel I feel a little bit guilty. Like I want to spend some time with a poem.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think another angle we can explore here is. So she's speaking for this huge population. First of all, she's speaking for mourning women, mourning wives, mourning mothers. But she's also, as I think you said, yeah, even if they clamp shut my tormented mouth, I'm in number 2 of the epilogue,
Yes.
through which 100 million people scream.
That's the exact line I was thinking of when you mentioned that.
Yeah, so I think the reason I bring that up is the role of the poet. And I think we've looked at some different quotes about this. But the role of the poet in Russia at that time is absolutely different from how we perceive the role of a poet today. This is not something, poetry at that time is not something abstract and foo-foo, right? It's like, and Liliana made this comparison, which I thought was quite apt, like poetry and poets were like the social media of that time. They were hugely influential and important in framing public consciousness and attitude towards things, which is why, they would be in the mouths of the people in power, why they would be concerns to them, right? I mean, what the fuck is a poet? But at that time, poet really had power.
Well, they're kind of like journalists in a way, poetic journalists, documentarians.
Right.
Like I said, that
Right.
one of the purposes of literature is to bear witness, to testify.
And I guess we have that maybe through like rappers, I guess. You could say like Kendrick Lamar is speaking for struggle today, for example. And so yeah, I mean you do have the role of like artists still, but definitely not poets in the same way that, we don't have poets like this today, right? Who have this much influence.
Well, recently, in recent history, that is 20th century history, we had Neruda, who was a popular poet in that sense, I guess.
I mean, does America have someone who threatens authorities with poetry?
Well, it'd be more like I'm thinking of like Dylan, back in the day, maybe not so much now, but like in the 60s, his words were on the lips of many people. The times they are a changing.
Yeah, I guess John Lennon, right?
John Lennon.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about the power of this woman with her words. It's invigorating and a different time, different standing that literature had at that moment.
Well, I think
Right?
we should savor that line. I mean, that is so powerful. Even
I just wasn't sure if I read the right section. So yeah, go on.
well, yeah, it's in the epilogue, part 2 of the epilogue. Even if they clamp shut my tormented mouth, through which 100 million people scream.
Well, okay, this is what I wanted you to say. I think we should rewind a tiny bit. Even to that earlier section, the image that you gave about the shroud. I just think maybe we should present this section a little bit more.
Okay, shall I read it? I've got it right in front of me.
Sure. Are you going to start with number 2, or where do you want to start at the top of that stanza?
No, I was gonna start.
Or maybe I'd like to name you all by name.
That's exactly where I was gonna start. The second paragraph in section 2 there at the end of this section called epilogue. Although the first line of part 2 is also very important. The hour has come to remember the dead. I mean,
right.
Yeah. I see you, I hear you, I feel you. Amazing.
Go on.
Amazing. All right, so starting with that line you mentioned. I'd like to name you all by name, but the list has been removed, and there is nowhere else to look. So I have woven you this wide shroud out of the humble words I overheard you use. Everywhere, forever and always, I will never forget one single thing. Even in new grief, even if they clamp shut my tormented mouth through which 100 million people scream. That's how I wish them to remember me when I am dead, on the eve of my Remembrance Day. I'll stop there.
I think we could go on a
Carry
little bit
on,
because
then.
I think okay. If someone someday in this country decides to raise a memorial to me, I give my consent to this festivity, but only on this condition. Do not build it by the sea where I was born. I have severed my last ties with the sea. Nor in the Tsar's park by the hallowed stump, where an inconsolable shadow looks for me. Build it here, where I stood for 300 hours, and no one slid open the bolt. And that's a good spot too. Because, being at the museum today, I was thinking about how we built this memorial for her.
Well, tell us about that. You took a field trip to, what is this museum?
It's the Anna Akhmatova Museum. It's in the flat, Punin's flat.
Punin, the third husband or common law husband.
Yeah, but he seems like the most significant person, or she spent the largest chunk of her life with him and in his house. Mm-hmm. She was there for years, and he's massively important, I guess, to the history of the Russian art scene at that time. I mean, he really was like fighting for the preservation of Western art in Soviet museums. So he's one of these. They were these nobles pre-revolution who then were trying to stay relevant and survive in this very new artistic climate where everything was Soviet realism, and if we know that stuff, so that context. Anyway, the museum is, what I like about it is that you enter and it's just covered in poetic graffiti. So people have written thousands probably of poems on all the walls, like bordering this museum, and everyone's just kind of writing stanzas or longer poems, their own work. So it's just a really cool atmosphere that you enter into. It's not like all pristine or too clean. It's got that kind of grit.
Mm-hmm.
And then they've just renovated a lot of these rooms to present them to you aesthetically how they would have been, and they kind of take different aspects of time. So they'll have a room that is more representative of pre-revolutionary Russia. Then you've got like a kommunalka, like the communal kitchen, which is much more sparse, and you see how little privacy they had. I mean, in this flat where, let's say, 4 nobles would have lived, like after the revolution, they've packed like 17 people into this small space, and her son had to like sleep and live in like a hallway just because like that's how cramped the conditions were. But what else was striking? We had a kind of a weird guide. So as we were entering this park, which is just outside the museum, this like wheelchair drives by us and like kind of gets stuck on a rock. So he kind of like jokes, and then he says something to us in English, and I just felt like, whoa, this is a weird way to start this day, like this day of like poetry, this kind of interesting character on a wheelchair who then ends up being our guide, and he stands for the first part of the tour, and then he kind of sits in a wheelchair for the second half. He was a very powerful presence, but I didn't really like him. So in the beginning, he kind of called out a couple of students like semi-confrontationally about them appearing bored, but in general his tone was just like kind of abrasive, and I just didn't feel like he made enough of an effort to really connect with our students. Like, we had a group of 8s, and I just felt like he was kind of demanding a certain level of respect or reverence rather than really doing the work of making teens who might be outside of the world of poetry like to feel what's special about this woman and her work. And he was just a strange guy, but the nice things he did was kind of recite a few poems from memory at various stages of the tour, and he did it in this like really like quiet voice often, and just with real conviction. So the memorized recitations were impressive, but he was kind of creepy, and he even I hate to say this because he was like handicapped guy, but he reminded me of like Richard III from Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a guy who's clearly like kind of got his own tormenting issues, and I couldn't really relax during the tour. And but that's all. That's my quick summary. The museum has also just opened a single exhibition to Brodsky, which seems pretty cool, and like that's next on my list because I'm very ignorant about him. But
wait, it's a Brodsky museum?
No, but it's Akhmatova museum, but
there's like a little corner
they have
for
some,
him.
Yeah, exactly. So they've made this big exhibition for, well, not big one, but like one room, which is like called Still Life, and it kind of takes a huge amount of his possessions, and like from each of the 4 angles, like let's say you're looking at it as a square, and like you look at each side, and each side kind of shows possessions from a different stage of his life. Like one is when he's living in New York and Boston, one is like more what he had in Russia, and yeah.
He's one of those who chose exile. Did he know Akhmatova? Were they friendly? I mean, I'll bet they...
Yes. Yeah. Akhmatova had something like a dacha in the later part of her career, but it wasn't quite a dacha status. In fact, she nicknamed it like a doghouse. But various people went to visit her, including Brodsky. So, yeah, he paid his tribute. He paid his respects. And
now, he was in a camp, too. So would this have been after he got out of the camp, and then
probably,
I don't know the details of his exile. Like, how did he get out, and when? Maybe we can look into.
Do you know this guy named Isaiah Berlin?
Yes. He wrote a book about Tolstoy called The Hedgehog and the Fox, I think.
Okay.
Isn't that who it was? I better check that, but go on.
He was like a prominent intellectual who had ties to her. So you may know, but I don't know much about him. He's a Russian-British social and political theorist.
He wrote The Hedgehog and the Fox, which was, I've read this. The subtitle is An Essay on Tolstoy's View of History, and he argues, well, we don't need to get into it, but he basically argues that Tolstoy was a hedgehog rather than a fox. This is an allusion to a couplet from Archilochus, who says, a fox knows many tricks, but a hedgehog knows only one big one. So he says Tolstoy was a hedgehog, meaning basically that he was kind of like monomaniacal. He had like one idea.
Okay.
So he's the one who met Akhmatova and called her tragic queen, was it?
Yeah, and I think they had quite a close relationship. And who else was gonna throw out? Like even Robert Frost visited Akhmatova.
Really?
Yeah.
In the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Wow. Was he...
And
now, she's associated with this movement called Acmeism. What can you tell us about that? Was Frost influenced by that? Was Brodsky?
I don't know, but my knowledge is like pretty Wikipedia surface. I mean, it sounds like it was anti-symbolist movement, which we briefly discussed before, which is quite exciting. So they really wanted the kind of more stark imagery and I guess, less pretension, they might say. But I mean, I don't want to charge symbolism with that, because obviously they would defend themselves too. But either way, I guess the main thing is that they were inspired young poets, eager to define themselves through movements, through their peer group, and doing all the stuff like producing magazines and working together and collaborating. But again, all of that was this fertile period, this fecund. Is that how to use that word? Fecund?
Fecund.
Fecund. I feel like you always take the alternate pronunciation regardless of what I'm going to say. Fair enough. This fecund is... So this fecund... I mean, the point is that art during the Tsar's
Sounds
time...
like fecal.
That was an exciting period, though, for artists, is my main point. It was, like, free and active.
Well, I don't know what the original is like, but it appears that Requiem is... Like, each section is stylistically a bit different, There's some pretty tight, structured verse forms, like couplets. There's like a section that's couplets, and then there are quatrains, and she's using rhyme. But then there are these prose sections and maybe some free verse sections as well. Is that your impression of it? It's like it's really like a woven shroud, a shroud woven of many diverse sources, like patches almost. It's rhapsodic in that sense. It's a text in that it's sewn together of these different bits. Is that how it appears to you? I think
that's like a really, yeah. I mean, I like that reading. I'm guilty maybe of not sitting with it as long as I should have, but I like that interpretation. It resonates. Should we read at least one more stanza? Kind of see where we go with it. Okay. So who read the instead of a preface?
I did.
Okay, so I'll read the dedication. Yeah. Okay. And remember, we're considering Akhmatova as the tragedy queen.
What translation are we reading?
We're reading a translation which we had difficulty ascribing to anyone, but we think it might be a woman named Jill Freshhertz, who apparently is a creative writing teacher and may or may not have been working at a high school which offered us this PDF. Fair? Is that a fair?
What's the URL, just in case people want to follow along?
Sure, and I guess we'll link it. So before I try and search for it now, we'll link it.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay, so... Dedication. Mountains fall before this grief. A mighty river stops its flow, but prison doors stay firmly bolted, shutting off the convict burrows and an anguish close to death. Fresh winds softly blow for someone. Gentle sunsets warm them through. We don't know this. We are everywhere the same, listening to the scrape and turn of hateful keys and the heavy tread of marching soldiers. Waking early, as if for early mass, walking through the capital run wild, gone to seed. We'd meet, the dead, lifeless, the sun, lower every day, the nieva mistier, but hope still sings forever in the distance. The verdict. Immediately a flood of tears, followed by a total isolation, as if a beating heart is painfully ripped out or thumped. She lies there, brutally laid out, but she still manages to walk, hesitantly, alone. Where are you, my unwilling friends? Captives of my 2 satanic years, what miracle do you see in a Siberian blizzard? What shimmering mirage around the circle of the moon? I send each one of you my salutation and farewell.
My 2 satanic years. That's a reference to the 17 months, I guess.
I think so, yeah.
That's a great phrase.
Hard times people lived through,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they make our woes seem pretty minuscule. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but...
I'm in purgatory, so what can I say?
Yeah. guess purgatory is better than hell.
Still feels pretty satanic at times. I noticed that.
Anything?
Well,
from this
not this,
stanza?
but I'm looking at the next section called Prelude or Introduction. Stars of death stood over us, and there's mention of another star later. Do you remember that? The star seems to be important.
Why don't you read the next stanza, and we can talk a little bit more about the poetry. The poetry.
Well, that's not the part that I'd like to read, actually.
But that next stanza seems pretty crucial. I mean, it's got the section that we...
Okay, well, I have a couple of phrases highlighted, so why not?
Okay.
Introduction,
Okay. All right.
Prelude. It happened like this when only the dead were smiling, glad of their release. That Leningrad hung around its prisons like a worthless emblem, flapping its peace. Shrill and sharp, the steam whistles sang short songs of farewell to the ranks of convicted, demented by suffering, as they, in regiments, walked along. Stars of death stood over us as innocent Russia squirmed under the blood-spattered boots and tires of the Black Mariahs.
Yeah.
Innocent Russia. She says that more than once.
Exactly.
Which is somewhat surprising given the, epitaph that we read. Or not epitaph, epigraph. It's kind of an epitaph too, since we're talking about a requiem. But
you're talking about the
yes,
opening.
with the mention of that dichotomy of foreign and domestic. You know, so innocent Russia. So it's like a.
I think that's the angle that I often take, right? Is that I'm like, look, Russia's innocent. Actual Russia is innocent.
Yeah. But at the same time, she seems to be saying we did this to ourselves. So there's an ambivalence there, or ambiguity.
Maybe, but I'd have to revisit that before I co-signed on that interpretation of the opening.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of got an interesting image from this first few lines of that prelude, because I was struggling with this part that Leningrad hung around its prisons like a worthless emblem flapping its peace. Liliana suggested that the word emblem actually might be more like kind of like a sign, a hanging sign from a chain that you might get, like representing a shop you might see outside a shop with the shop name, and it's like that is Leningrad's, like an image of Leningrad just kind of flapping.
Like a cheap, paltry thing.
Yeah, and for me, maybe it's the fact that the city has just come to stand for nothing. Right? It's like it hasn't... And in a way, if we come back to what my tour guide was saying about don't call this St. Petersburg prison, it's like they... Yeah, because the city was so spineless, maybe, in a way, in standing up to this injustice.
So where's the innocence?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point.
I mean, of course, there are some people who are relatively innocent compared to others, but I think it's still... That's an interesting contrast, because in the beginning, I do strongly feel that, at least from the translation, it's like this happened here, it wasn't elsewhere, we did it to ourselves. But then at the same time she's talking about innocent Russia, and then later she says innocent, or let's see, how many innocent blameless lives are being taken away.
Well, I wonder if we say as innocent Russia squirmed, you could read that two ways. You could either read that as innocent Russia being the totality of Russia, or you could read it as the innocent part of Russia squirmed. So
right. Like I understand what you're saying. Not that all of Russia is innocent, but the innocent part of Russia. Right. Yes, that makes sense. How about the verdict? That's actually the name of one of the sections, you know. The verdict.
And interestingly, when I asked the museum like what we should read in preparation, like they said Requiem and Verdict, which is interesting because then I realized Verdict is part of Requiem, but clearly it's like a crucial part.
Prigovor.
Yeah.
I need to slaughter memory, turn my living soul to stone, then teach myself to live again. But
yeah, that's the part that stands out to me.
It says, but how?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great quatrain. I have a lot of work to do today. I need to slaughter memory, turn my living soul to stone, then teach myself to live again. Damn. Great.
Yeah. I bet it's even better in
Well,
Russian too.
let's hear it.
Have to find it.
That would be good for the intro. Have Liliana read that quatrain.
Yeah, because I was thinking about the opening though, because I really like the idea of her speaking for everyone. But I mean, I can read you a little bit. Like it says, "У меня сегодня много дела." Like that's I have a lot of work to do today. Надо память до конца убить. Надо, чтоб душа окаменела. I'm gonna do a shitty job. Надо снова научиться жить. А не то горячее шелест лета. That's like already going further. But some of it's not that hard to read.
I heard the word
Надо
for summer
память.
in there.
Yeah, exactly. That's what already. But I'm already getting onto that last stanza. But у меня сегодня много дела. That's pretty easy to translate. Today I have a lot to do. Yeah, I have a lot of things to do. Надо means like I have to. Память до конца, like память, yeah, memory to the end, kill or destroy. Надо, I have to.
But
it's interesting because nado is like Spanish, right? Like no, it's not gonna be the same. Nado, no. Чтоб душа is soul. So that the soul okamenyela, like okamen is stone. So that the soul becomes stone. I need to nado snova means again, teach myself to live.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, so yeah.
But what is
I didn't say anything particular.
What is the verdict? Is it like the verdict in her son's case, or like
that's
the
what
death
I thought.
sentence
Yeah.
imposed on her husband, or can we understand it as like the
it could be sentence, by the way, yeah, as well. Like that's when I put that into Google, I get sentence.
Well, yes.
I don't know if that's different necessarily.
Well,
than verdict,
yes, but you know, could it also be her own verdict or sentence? In other words, it's her punishment to write this requiem, to be the witness, the one who has to tell the tale.
I think that's good. I think that's very apt to suggest that. It seems like that's definitely how she's taken it anyway, right? Like it is like the albatross around her neck, but something that she has taken on willingly.
Mm-hmm.
With great responsibility. And that's the thing. And when you contrast this poetry with the maybe more playful ideas of like the Acmeism, you know, it's clear why she couldn't really. I mean, it seems so kind of trivial, right, compared to the shit that she takes on later. I mean, if we really, I don't know, maybe we were uncomfortable ranking like poetry in that way. I mean, it all has its place, but
I'm gonna read another random bit. This is
cool.
Section 5 of the introduction. For 17 months I have been screaming, calling you home. I've thrown myself at the feet of butchers for you, my son and my horror.
I underlined that.
Everything has become muddled forever. I can no longer distinguish who is an animal, who a person, and how long the wait can be for an execution. Maybe this relates to the verdict. There are now only dusty flowers, the chinking of the thurible, tracks from somewhere into nowhere, and staring me in the face and threatening me with swift annihilation. An enormous star. There's that image of the star again.
Yeah, and I circled that and wrote next to it because I wasn't really like sure how to take star. By the way, your dog is in the background, which is fine, but just...
You want to pause? Alright, how do we pick this back up?
Yeah, the star is something that actually I had difficulty grasping. I even like wrote next to it in my notes. So why this recurrent image of star? What's your theory?
Well, and then it occurs again later in the section headed To Death. To Death. It says the pole star blazes. I don't know. The image of the star has occurred at least 3 times, and I don't know what it means.
I don't know, because if it was like a image of the government, that might make sense.
Well, the red Soviet star, but I don't think so.
Yeah, that seems almost too crude, right? Like too... At the same time, I think she's referred to the stars that are over her beloved in Siberia, but threatening her. It's threatening her.
How about the chinking of the thurible?
I liked that. I looked up the thurible. It's a bowl for burning incense, like in a Catholic or Orthodox church.
A metal censer, and
right.
It's like, well, you've seen Good Catholic Boy that you are. I'm sure you've seen a priest swinging it. It's like on a chain, and they swing it around.
Yeah, the smells are fantastic.
What's usually it's like incense coming out of it.
Yeah, I think it's like kind of like a frankincense type thing. Although maybe I'm just shouting out Christmas songs. I'm not sure. Right.
So she says the chinking of the thurible. I mean, it's that's like associated with the mass, I guess.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. So, what else have we got?
I think we can wrap it up there. I mean, we could continue to look at different sections of the poem, but I think we've given the reader enough of a taste that they can seek it out.
Here's another one for you. Madness with its wings has covered half my soul. It feeds me fiery wine and lures me into the abyss.
Yeah, we keep hitting the exact same sections because as we were like closing up, that stanza jumped out at me too.
Again, it's a quatrain. This section is like all quatrains, and I'm not looking at the original Russian right now, but they look like pretty tight lines that probably rhyme. Like it's very carefully structured verse. Beautiful in translation, and I'm sure in the original it's even more amazing.
Yeah, I'd like to read some more of her, a different range of her poetry. I saw a nice description that said that her early poems usually picture a man and a woman involved in the most poignant, ambiguous moment of their relationship, much imitated and later parodied by Nabokov and others. But that's just an interesting idea, right? That she would isolate this poignant and ambiguous moment in a relationship and write about that. It's kind of cool to think about first of all, locating it and then like exploiting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, do you have an example of one of these poems that depicts that?
I'd like to see. I mean, the only section I liked this earlier poem that she wrote. It's from a collection, and it says, "Bays broke the low shore, boats ran out to sea, and I dry my salty hair on a flat rock a mile from land. Swam to me the green fish, flew to me the white seagull. I was gay and bold and wicked, and never knew I was happy." It's like, yeah. But I like this like reverse of, I know it has like a technical name, but this like reverse of language where it says, "Swam to me the green fish."
Right.
Flew to me. I mean, you wonder if that's like someone who's gotten too literal in the translation, or if it's like intentional that they've reversed the typical structure.
Inverted syntax.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a nice last couplet too. "I was gay and bold and wicked and never knew I was happy." Like, and never knew I was happy. So that means she was happy? You know?
Mm-hmm.
Or, because if you don't know you're happy, are you happy? I don't know.
Can we say, to generalize, can we say that like she began as kind of a romantic poet and then ended through force of circumstance as like a chronicler of historical horror and kind of an epic poet? I mean, it seems like she transitioned from lyric to epic poetry, even though there are lyrical qualities in this epic poem. It's still like with Requiem, there's more, the focus is more on chronicling what happened. You know, there's almost a journalistic witness bearing motive, whereas before it's more like exploration of emotional states, and you know, it was a more innocent time.
Right. And I think that's like doubly important because of what we associate with the Soviet Union of like erasing things, erasing people, burning records, removing records. So like now we have the opposite problem. We have too much, right? Like I have too many photos. I have too much content to deal with. But at that time, it's like, no, we're gonna lose people. Like I think she was really concerned about her first husband before Punin, like just about keeping him alive. So it's like, yeah, it's the work of not forgetting, and which we read earlier, right? And how crucial that is. Like she's not, and that what I really liked in one of the lines that you read was like, even in new grief, I'm not going to forget the old grief. You know, like you're going to make me suffer, but that doesn't make up for the fact that you've made me suffer before as well. Like all of it's going to be remembered.
To remember, to memorialize. That was the other word I was trying to think of when I was talking about bearing witness and testifying. The other function is to memorialize, you know, so that this not be forgotten. It's almost like what Herodotus says his purpose is in his history, you know. It's like so that the deeds of the Greeks and the barbarians not be forgotten from the earth, you know.
But it's interesting because like, why do we remember? Like, okay, you get this, the one person would respond, oh, so we don't like repeat the evils, and I don't want to downplay that important aspect of like not trying to repeat history, but on another level, like why this need to remember? Like, you know, what skeptical part of me can feel like that's like very ego driven, right? Like you must remember the legacy of my ex-husband, for example, or you must remember me, even talking about when she went into how, you know, I want to have a memorial built for me, but don't build it here, build it next to the wall. So like the importance of memory is interesting, and how much how much value we place on it.
But it's like the request of a Pythia or some kind of prophetess, you know. It's just an idiosyncratic request, which I think we might feel obligated to honor because she has done the hard spiritual work of memorializing, you know. So, okay, she wants to be she wants her memorial set up in such a way. That's her request. Let's honor it. I mean, she's earned it. She's earned the right to request
Sure.
that.
But again, like, they're remembering. Is it remembering out of a desire for retribution even? Like, if you see all this horrible suffering, what are we remembering it so that those people, so that they get their ends eventually? Or, like,
maybe that's part of it. I mean,
the motivations
it's
behind.
like Primo Levi, the Holocaust poet, or Holocaust poet and prose writer as well, like, sure, a part of it is motivated by revenge, but given what he's gone through, what do you expect?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that, you could argue that is also coming from from a sense of compassion, right? So where is something compassion and where is it revenge? I mean, I think those two things, interestingly, you wouldn't necessarily associate them, but actually there's probably like they're pretty intimately connected. If you think about, like, your compassion for someone suffering, right, is like, you don't want to just let it be without any reaction.
It reminds me of the late Alexander Coburn's question to, journalists of the next generation. He would ask, is your hatred pure enough? Like, do you really want to fight this fight? So, this act of bearing witness, it doesn't make you a good person necessarily. You still have your faults. Or take someone like Julian Assange, right? Like, he's probably a bit of a dick, but that's just the kind of personality that is sometimes associated with someone who is willing to make this heroic sacrifice to tell the truth, to bear witness. Like, he's not gonna conform to your ideal of a good person, or a person who respects your feelings in every circumstance, because he has, like, he's dealing with larger issues, trying to expose war crimes and shit. Like, if he upsets a few people, or is not sensitive to every single person's needs at every single moment, that's just to be expected, right?
I take your point that these things often go together. This certain type of personality that's required.
Well, and she's, she has a certain authority. She is, whether she was, like, officially designated as such, she is the mouth through which 100 million voices scream, or whatever. I mean, no one voted for her. She says some old woman asked her to record this, which, as you say, may be fictional, may not. It doesn't matter, right? Like, she is the one that is giving us this testimony, so we just have to accept it for what it is. But before we wrap here, the section called Crucifixion, which seems to be an important part of this, an important section in this piece. Although, I mean, I don't know that the verse is as powerful as that in other sections, but there's this interesting idea of the mother versus the father, right? And the role of the mother as what I would call Mater Dolorosa. We talked about this when we were looking at Picasso's Weeping Woman, right? Remember the mother?
Yep, sure.
The dolorous mother, the mother of sorrows, or whatever, right? So it begins with the epigraph, "Weep not for me, mother, I am alive in my grave." Of course, she's referring to her son here, but then, and also her son is, Jesus in a way, and she's in the role of Mary. And then she says, to his father he said, why hast thou forsaken me? But to his mother, weep not for me. So it's like the solitary sorrow of the mother. No one knows the sorrow of the mother. I'm sure my mom would agree with that. But what do you think about her? Her role as feminine witness or maternal witness. Like the grief of the mother. Can that compare?
Yeah, I think that's central.
Can that compare to anything else or to anyone else's grief?
I mean, I just think it needs to be respected more.
Mm-hmm.
The woman suffering, especially at times of war. The women's suffering needs to be listened to, and that sounds kind of, basic,
but is there a kind of accusation there too? Remember earlier she said, "My son and my horror," which is, I don't even know what to say about that line. It's so powerful in a disturbing way, right? But is there like an accusatory tone here? It's like, oh yeah, you ask your father, why has he forsaken you? But to me, you basically just say, shut up and quit crying, woman.
Yeah, I'm trying. How do you interpret that?
I don't know. That's I'm still wrestling with it. That's why I'm raising the issue. It just seems significant in this very short section called Crucifixion. And also, I noted that the second part of this was written in Tashkent. So what was she doing there? She went there.
I can tell you the story behind that.
I don't
if you don't know that.
Uzbekistan. Why did she go there?
That's pretty. Well, it's kind of one irony of her life is, despite the fact that Stalin can be interpreted as like the thorn in her side, to kind of continue that Jesus reference, but he actually elected to evacuate many of the important artists from St. Petersburg just prior to the siege of Leningrad. And so she was spared the experience of being in St. Petersburg during that horrific time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so she was, and that's why she was in Tashkent. And then she came back afterwards.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And then she went on to write some patriotic poems during the war that, again, were seen as like morale boosters.
Oh, she did. So a very complex character. Well, I mean,
and she even wrote some poems in praise of Stalin.
She did.
Which later she said because she was and she did that in an attempt to, get her son and husband to be, for their sentences to be reduced or released, and she was successful.
Oh,
but I mean, again, this is like, so there was, and at another point she wrote a letter to Stalin. So yeah, a lot of a lot of different interactions with this guy, and then she dreamed about Stalin dying, apparently, like just before he died. And the tour guide said something weird after that. He's like, and just imagine at that time, millions of people had the same dream for a leader to die. Can you imagine something like that happening today? and he said it in this like really weird way, where it's like
in a hopeful manner, like he's almost
like it is happening today. Like we're all but he also like said it in this like cheeky way where it was interpreted like it could never happen today,
I see.
So it was like really playful the way he kind of doubled that question. But,
well, I feel like we've only.
Sorry, I couldn't give you more on the father.
Well, no,
stuff.
that's fine. I was just gonna say we've only scratched the surface. Like, I mean, we're reading a translation. It's only one piece. Apparently, she has a very rich history. She went her work went through many stages, and she had different reactions to and relations with the power structures at the time. So it's this was definitely a good place to start, and hopefully we can explore her work more in the future.
I'd like that.
But next
we got?
I think we're gonna have a look at the great Harold Pinter's Nobel Prize speech, and there's a video of this, and you can also read it. I'll put links in my Substack post if you listeners want to read it in advance or watch the video. But I can't remember what year he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, but his speech is to this day very inspiring, very powerful, one of my favorites. So
Awesome.
yeah, so that'll be next, and then you will have another text for us, and then we might be taking a brief break, but more on that later.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for listening, everybody. As we say in Russia, do svidaniya.
Texting.
Приговор. И упало каменное слово на мою еще живую грудь. Ничего, ведь я была готова, справлюсь с этим как-нибудь. У меня сегодня много дела, надо память до конца убить. Надо, чтоб душа окаменела, надо снова научиться жить, а не то. Горячий шелест лета, словно праздник за моим окном. Я давно предчувствовала этот светлый день и опустелый дом. 1939 год. Лето.